Hey, good evening, everybody. Thank you for attending tonight's webinar on captive wildlife safety and security. My name is Rob Laidlaw. I'm Executive Director of an organization called ZooCheck Canada, and we've been involved for the last 38 years in all kinds of issues pertaining to the keeping of wildlife in captivity. The reason we're doing this particular webinar tonight is that we've had numerous requests over the last number of months from people across the province who are dealing with wildlife issues, particularly wildlife in zoos and menageries and kept as exotic pets. And a lot of people have expressed some concern about safety, but can't really articulate what their concerns are. So we thought we would do this webinar tonight and familiarize people with some of the basic ideas that you have to think about when you're talking about safety and security when you're dealing with dangerous wild animals in captivity. There will be two speakers tonight, myself, and a little bit later, Michelle Hammers. I will introduce Michelle when it's her time to speak. For those of you who are not familiar with me or ZooCheck, I'll just give you a very brief rundown on my experience. I'm a chartered biologist, been involved for the last 40 some odd years in animal welfare issues, with about 38 of them involved in wildlife in captivity. I've authored all kinds of reports and briefs and book chapters, as well as quite a number of books. And I've been working not only in Canada, but on these kinds of issues throughout the world. And when I say wildlife in captivity, it's a multifaceted field. So my involvement has run the gamut from zoo design to zoo operations to captive animal welfare, public safety and security, education and conservation, and the development of laws, regulations, and policies governing how wildlife in captivity is kept. So if anyone has any questions, they can contact me directly through ZooCheck, and that contact information is easy to find. Like I said, captive wildlife safety and security is the topic for this evening, and it's something that comes up time and time again, and it's certainly a big issue in Ontario, because in Ontario, we have a very peculiar situation. It's very different from most of the other provinces and the territories, in that Ontario is the only province in Canada that does not provide any meaningful regulation or control over the keeping of exotic wild animals in captivity. And to a lot of people, that's a surprise. They would think that Ontario would have a great regulatory system, and that if you keep lions and tigers or kangaroos or any of these other kinds of creatures that you would normally see in a more traditional zoo environment, then somebody would be out to inspect you and you'd have to satisfy certain criteria. Well, that is not the case at all. Ontario is completely unregulated when it comes to the keeping of exotic wild animals. And that means animals that are not native to the province. They're not our normal wildlife species that if we went up to Algonquin Park or somewhere else, we might see. The exotic animals are unregulated, and it's been that way, and it's been recognized as a problem for being that way for about 40 years. And unfortunately, we are still in the same situation today. Now, we have not got any provincial laws that really provide meaningful governance over the keeping of exotic wildlife in captivity. So many municipalities have stepped up to the plate to sort of fill that gap, because they may be dealing with problems in their municipalities with regard to exotic animals in all kinds of different situations. And the only way that they can address those problems, because there is no regulation at a higher level, is by passing their own laws. And we know of at least 150 Ontario municipalities that have chosen to pass local bylaws to restrict or control the keeping of exotic animals within their boundaries. And there's some commonalities amongst those laws, but there's also a lot of inconsistencies. It really should be something that is directed by the province, but like I said, that hasn't happened yet. Now, there's a number of concerns when you're looking at exotic wildlife in captivity, but primary amongst them is human safety. And that's human safety not only for adults, but for children, because children and young kids, teenagers, they tend to want to be around these animals. They think they're really nifty or cool, so they want to go and see them. Some of them want to interact with them. And a lot of children and young people have no understanding of the risks that are involved when you're around exotic animals. So with no laws at the provincial level, like I said, a lot of municipalities have passed their own exotic animal bylaws. And when municipalities don't do this, and they've got exotic animals in their jurisdiction, there can be problems. Now, some of those problems relate to the actual conditions the animals were kept in, so a lot of them will experience very poor welfare. We've certainly seen that right across the province for the last 38 years. Some horrendously terrible situations for animals. There may also be risks to the local environment and to wildlife through the transmission of disease. If animals get out and they carry disease or other types of pathogens that can be transmitted to native wildlife, that can be a big problem for our own native wildlife. We're going to talk about safety because that's the subject this evening. But just to give you an idea of some of the other issues that can arise, you have nuisance complaints that are dealt with through bylaws by municipalities, and they can run the gamut from noise to odor to waste disposal to excess traffic. There are all kinds of issues associated with the keeping of exotic wildlife in captivity. We've even been told that in certain instances, there may be decreased property values for the properties that are adjacent to or nearby to, a big menagerie or a roadside zoo. Those property values may go down, and it may be harder to sell those properties if people want to move off of them. There's a tremendous waste of municipal time, energy, and resources when you're dealing with these issues at a local level. Again, it should be at the provincial level. There may be lengthy, expensive court actions. But probably the most important thing amongst all of these things, and they're all important to some degree or another, is that municipalities, if they don't have laws, have no control over what goes on in their jurisdictions. And we're talking about public safety here tonight. And by public, I mean not only the general public that may visit these animals, but bystanders, community members, visitors who actually do make an effort to come and see them, but also the custodians of the animals themselves. And when you don't have any laws and you don't have any controls, you can have all kinds of problems arise. And one of them is public safety, and it can result in human injuries and death. And here in Ontario, we've had our own fair share of injuries to humans, deaths, and animal escapes. In my time, there's been a young boy at a menagerie that was tending, 16 years old, tending to lions, and had his arm ripped off through a barrier. Another young woman at the Dornoch Zoo was mauled through a barrier. A 16-year-old boy in Hanover, Ontario was killed by his uncle's pet tiger. And if you look at that slide with the tiger looking out the top of that barn, this is probably the most one of the more famous or infamous tigers in the province, in that tiger was the tiger that killed Norman Buwalda, an exotic animal owner in Southwold Township down near London. That tiger had actually attacked a young 10-year-old boy when it was being walked outside of its cage on a leash. And the boy had very severe injuries. He's going to suffer from them for the rest of his life. That prompted the municipality to look at a bylaw. They put in a very bad bylaw. It was poorly written and not very well thought out. Norman Buwalda, who was reasonably wealthy, challenged the bylaw in the courts and won. And then on January 10th, 2010, that tiger in that picture killed him. So there's been all kinds of things like this in the province, and unfortunately, it hasn't been enough to galvanize people in a political arena to finally try to address the wildlife in captivity problem here in the province. So one of the questions that we often get from people, and some of them just don't know, other people really honestly believe that they do know, and it's regarding whether or not exotic animals are safe. And of course, there is a continuum. There are some exotic animals, like small rodents that are exotic, that are not particularly dangerous, maybe through disease transmission, but physically they're not dangerous, but then there are other types of animals like big cats and wild dogs and bears that can be exceptionally dangerous. So we often are asked the question, are exotic wild animals safe? And the reason people ask that question, because it should really be self-evident that big, powerful, fast-moving animals with teeth and claws, that they're going to be dangerous. But a lot of the people who own these animals downplay, dismiss, or the risks involved in being around their animals, or they don't understand their animals. So it is a question that comes up. And when you're asking that question, there's a number of things to think about. It's things that are going to impact on how that animal behaves. And when you look at captive animals, particularly captive animals in poor circumstances, then the risks inherent in dealing with them or keeping them rise quite substantially. Because when you look at these animals, you see that they're not generally going to behave as their wild counterparts do. In the wild, if an animal is feeling some discomfort or threat or whatever, even if it's a predator, it may choose to move away. In a captive situation, it can't do that. If the animal's been bottle fed, it hasn't gone through a normal social development process, so it may be psychologically compromised and won't react like a normal animal. The animals may be stressed, and when they're in small cages and they're being viewed, they may not be able to remove themselves from the source of that stress, and as a result, that can impact their behaviors. There can be a lack of understanding of the animals on the part of the custodians who have them, who honestly believe they're safe, but they don't realize that their animals actually are safe. Often it's because the animals have behaved a certain way their whole lives, but we see all kinds of cases where a potentially dangerous exotic animal behaves the same way 99 times in a row or 999 times in a row. But the next time after that, the circumstances are such that that animal will kill somebody. And that's what Norman Boalda found, because he had interacted with his cats for a very long time. For some of the animals, like the big cats, they may be genetically hardwired to react to certain triggers. So it could be a cat that's normally docile that sees some trigger. It may be a stumble, it may be something else in the environment that causes that instinctual need to attack. And generally they would attack using what's called a kill bite on the back of the neck. And the most famous instance of that was Roy Horn in the Las Vegas magic show, Siegfried and Roy, a number of years ago. But there can be all kinds of triggers. There was another case at the Halliburton Wolf Center where the wolves that had been interacting with their custodians for quite a while, one of the custodians who was very experienced just tripped, and that triggered an attack by these normally docile wolves. So there can be these triggers that can cause an attack to happen that can result in catastrophic circumstances for whoever they're attacking. And there's sort of a saying when you're dealing with exotic animals, whether it's in zoos or whether it's in private situations, and it relates to dangerous animals, and that's that all these dangerous animals are entirely safe until they're not. And I think that's something that should always be kept in mind. They are safe until they're not. They can, even though they may have been docile, even though they may have been friendly, even though they may have seemed entirely tame, some people would claim they're domesticated, they can turn around at some point and just kill you. Now, a lot of people say, well, dogs can kill you too. Well, lots of people hurt by dogs, but there was a study done a few years ago that showed that when you look at the issue statistically, dog bites and deaths by domesticated dogs on human caretakers or bystanders, and you compare that to an animal like a tiger, that the chances of a tiger owner being killed by their tiger are 360 to 720 times more than the chance of a dog owner being killed by a dog. Yeah, dogs can be dangerous sometimes, but chances are they're not going to kill you. And when you think about it, it makes sense, because I've been attacked by dogs. I used to work at the Humane Society and do dog projects. I've been attacked by dogs, and I can tell you that even with big dogs, an adult human can usually intervene or stop a big dog attack. You may be bitten a number of times, but you can stop that. If a tiger or a lion attacks you, you can't stop that, and it'll be over before you can prevent the damage that that animal is intending on doing. People also say the same about native wildlife, so moose, coyotes, wolves, American black bears. You know, they're dangerous too, so why should we care about these animals in cages? Well, these are animals that generally would, in most circumstances in their life, would be relatively hesitant to encounter people. You know, not all of them, but many of them. They have gone through probably a normal social development process. They have room, they have chance. You know, if they see or feel threatened, they have a chance to get away. There's a lot of mitigating factors that make native wildlife far different than exotic wild animals in captivity. And when you look at what the professional zoo and sanctuary industries say about big cats and wild dogs and some of these other creatures that really everybody should recognize as extremely hazardous, you see that they take the threats posed by these animals extremely seriously. Most of them have very stringent safety standards. They have protocols, they have emergency plans, they have all kinds of features in their barriers, even in the design of facilities that hold these animals. The fencing and barrier levels run generally, like for big cats, from about 16 to 23 feet high, so very high. And they have a no contact management protocols. They say for adult big cats, there should never be any contact, direct contact between keepers or custodians and the animals. If there is any contact, it would generally be when it's anesthetized through a veterinary process, and that would be about it. And in terms of members of the public, no members of the public should ever be allowed to contact these animals. And the professional zoo and sanctuary associations won't even let them get close to the barriers that confine these animals, because so many people have been injured or killed through barriers. So it's something that groups that work with these animals in a professional capacity, and that governments who deal with these animals in a professional capacity take very seriously. These animals are not safe. You cannot become complacent with them. You have to take every safeguard you can to ensure that whoever is interacting with them, if they choose to do so, is doing so in the safest way possible. Preferably, they shouldn't be interacting with them directly, and certainly that no member of the public can ever get into physical contact with these animals, whether directly or through a barrier. And it's really just common sense. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Michelle Hammers. And before I do that, I'll just tell you a little bit about her. And Michelle, actually, I met I think it was about 8 years ago, and she's from the Netherlands. She has a BSc in Animal Husbandry and Welfare, an MSc in Animal Biology, and is a member of the Royal Society of Biology and the designated European professional biologist. She has direct experience working with dangerous animals such as chimpanzees, and has specialized in captive wildlife behavior and welfare for a number of years. During the most recent few years, she has been conducting research on the Canadian exotic pet trade. And Michelle recently co-authored a paper on regulatory solutions to the trade, use, and keeping of exotic pets. And that paper is getting great traction right around the world. It's a peer-reviewed scientific paper about this issue. She's also a World Animal Protection Wildlife Campaign Manager, so she's responsible for the bulk of the exotic pet welfare campaign for the organization in Canada. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over for Michelle to get into more of the nitty-gritty of cages and safety with regard to exotic wild animals.
Thanks, Rob. I just want to check, can you see my presentation? Yeah?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Okay. I already see a couple of questions in the Q&A. I would encourage people to definitely post questions, and we'll get to them, if not during the presentation, afterwards. As Rob mentioned, my presentation will be about captive wildlife safety. And the first thing I would like to emphasize, as Rob mentioned, a common misconception that I encounter in my work is that people portray these animals as being domesticated, as being tame. And I cannot emphasize enough that lions, tigers, chimpanzees, whether they're captured from the wild or captive bred, they are wild animals. They are genetically wild. They have not co-evolved with us as people, like our domesticated cats and dogs, and therefore their behaviors will always remain a little bit hard to read and at times risky, definitely when we talk about these bigger, more dangerous animals that can actually cause great harm to us. So what I'd like to do first today is talk a bit about the animals themselves. As I said, they are wild animals, and just to drive that point, I just want to share with you how these animals look like. You know, as you can see on this slide, how big they can grow, how far they can jump, up to 11 meters. To give a comparison, that is about as tall as a telephone pole. And just to really show you what these animals are capable of. Also, what I would like to mention is that lions can breed year-round. They'll have an average number of offspring of 3, and they live about 15 years in the wild, and likely longer in captivity, because many animals tend to live longer in captivity. Moving on, some other characteristics of lions. They have quite the claws, as you can see, up to 3.8 centimeters. They are quite loud. You can hear their roars up to 67 kilometers, 4 miles. And they're mostly night animals. So they're much more sensitive to light than we are, and they're mostly active at dusk and dawn and at night. So during the day, when you might see these animals, they might be lying down and they seem very calm and quiet, but they actually get very active at night. And that's something you might not be exposed to since most zoos are open during the daytime. As Rob mentioned, when talking about domesticated dogs and if they're as dangerous as these exotic animals, the bite force of lions and tigers and many of the other wild animals is much stronger than our domesticated dogs. So it makes sense to me that statistic, that it's more likely that a tiger would kill an owner than a dog based on the bite strength. They're quite fast. They can't hold that speed for very long, but they can easily outrun us. And they are evolved to hunt big animals like zebra and wildebeest. And as Rob mentioned, what they usually do, they go through for the throat. They crush the windpipe, and that's how they kill. A male adult lion can eat up to 40 kilograms of meat in one sitting. And they tend to hunt animals that can weigh up to 300 kilograms. So you can imagine the power that is needed in order to bring such an animal down. Also, something I'd like to point out is that we're talking about safety. Animal welfare is very close and near and dear to my heart. And just to let you know that these animals roam around, you know, they're from Africa. They roam around, and their territories can be up to 400 square kilometers. And nothing really in captivity can compare to that. Lions can jump, as you can see. They can climb. You might not see it often, but it's something to be aware of because many enclosures will have climbing structures, and that will affect the actual height a lion needs to cover in case they want to attempt an escape. And as we can see here, lions, they can climb. This was taken in South Africa, and the lion attempted to escape his enclosure at a wildlife park. So moving on to tigers. So those are the two, you already noticed probably tigers and lions is the main focus of this presentation because they're most relevant, I think, currently in Ontario. We have done some research on how many animals are being kept. And when it comes to dangerous animals, tigers and lions are surprisingly kept in high enough numbers to be concerned about. As you can see, tigers are actually kind of bigger, stronger, faster than lions. They are extremely powerful. As Rob mentioned, even though if they're bred in captivity, as in the case of Siegfried and Roy, they can still come after their trainer in a split second without any warning. There's several types of tigers. The largest one is Siberian Tiger, and the measurements you see here are reflecting the characteristics of the Siberian Tiger. They can also breed year-round. On average, they give birth to 1 to 7 cubs, and they can give birth every 3 to 4 years. In the wild, they usually live up to 10 years, but in captivity, they can live longer, even up to 18 years. In comparison to lions who can climb, tigers are excellent swimmers as well. They can swim many, many kilometers, and they're excellent climbers as well. And these are all things to keep in mind. And here there's a beautiful slow motion picture how a tiger can just leap up from the ground while standing still to catch a piece of meat. It's incredible, it seems very effortless. And you can only imagine if the tiger has the ability to build up some speed, how much more further and higher the animal can jump. Same with lions, tigers, their teeth, everything, how they've been evolved is to hunt big prey and to kill. They have a slightly weaker roar than the lions because they communicate differently. The solitary, for example, so there's less need likely for these animals to communicate over far distances. And similar to lions, they are also very active at dusk and dawn and during night. So their vision is much, much better than ours.
Michelle, can I just let you know that you're in presenter mode rather than full screen mode?
I don't know how to display setting. Is that it? Is that better?
It looks better, yes.
Okay, perfect. Apologies for that. You saw all my notes. So moving on, a little bit more about tigers. They're quite powerful as well. They hunt big mammals, including elephant calves, water buffalo, and similar to lions, they have a similar mode of killing is by suffocating and crushing the windpipe, which is really the most effective way for them to take it down a prey. They are known to consume up to 10 kilograms of meat a day. And for them, they have a huge territory. So males can have a territory up to 500 square kilometers. For females, it's about half the size. So they're very active and they're made to hunt and to search for prey. Well, they might not look like if you see them in a zoo, because usually when you see them, they'll probably be lying around and be not very active. Moving on to safety. So when I came to Canada, I was asked to visit several zoos in Ontario and write reports on them and to compare them to the few legislation that exists, little legislation that exists. So, well, I have a background in animal welfare and behavior. I think everybody can estimate or kind of get a feel for how safe it is in a certain zoo. So some simple questions you can ask yourself when you're on a property or when you visit the zoo is like, how difficult is it to enter the property? So is there, for example, a perimeter fence? And I'll talk a bit about that later. How easy is it for me to reach an animal? Like, can I reach an animal through the fencing that it's kept within? Can I even enter the cage? Like, are there locks that I can see? Are they closed? Is it easy to enter the cage? Other questions also include from the perspective from the animal. So how easy would it be for the animal to escape? So taking into consideration, for example, how high a lion can jump or a tiger, taking into consideration all the furnishment that might be within an enclosure, would it be easy for an animal to escape? Similar, is it easy for an animal to reach a visitor? And could it leave the property without any, once it escapes its enclosure, would it be easy for the animal to leave the property? So what I've done, I've pulled some quotes from CASA, which is the only zoo body in Canada that accreditates zoos, zoological institutions. While I have to say up front that we're not always in agreement with them, when it comes to safety standards, I think they are pretty much often in line with safety standards that are acceptable throughout the world. If you look at European institutions or institutions, zoological institutions in the United States, when it comes to safety, they are very much aware that animals can be dangerous and that you can't gamble on that nothing will happen. So as you can see, a complete barrier must exist around the animal enclosure. And I have an example here. This is back in Belgium. I actually did an internship for the zoo. And as you can see, on the, I think on the right side, you see that's the zoo. And on the left side is the city of Antwerp. And it's one of those city zoos. So it's in the heart really of the city. Actually, if you go by train, you'll step out of the station and there is the zoo. So it's really important that these animals just can't, you know, if they escape, which sometimes happen due to mistakes, that they can wander into town. So a guideline is that surrounding all the enclosures, which is called a perimeter fence, should be a fence with a height of minimum 2.5 meters, so 8 feet, can be higher. It should be quite sturdy. And it not only prevents animals from going out, but also prevents people from coming in at night, for example. There are plenty of examples of people when they had a night of drinking and they think, oh, it's fun to say hi to the tigers or something. A fence like that, or a wall in this case like that, would prevent that from happening. It's very important that this fence is independent from any animal exhibit. So it can be that the enclosure fence also functions as a property or perimeter fence. The next thing that is quite widely acknowledged within the professional zoological community is that you cannot have contact with dangerous animals. I myself have worked with chimpanzees who are extremely dangerous, and all those animals were born in captivity. They were all highly psychologically scarred. There used to be a joke in the community that they would ask you to raise all your 10 fingers, and if somebody missed a finger, you know they worked with chimpanzees. So the sanctuary I worked for, it was off limits to physically contact any animal that they kept, even the less dangerous animals. It's really a mindset, I think, that's very common within the zoo industry, that you're just not supposed to touch wild animals, and you need to send that clear message to visitors as well. So to prevent visitors from entering or coming too close to an enclosure and potentially touching an animal or a dangerous animal is a visited barrier, or also known as a standoff barrier. This is a picture I took in Greater Vancouver Zoo, and you can see quite clearly that there is a barrier that prevents people from coming up straight to the fence. And this fence, I believe this is an enclosure of a lion. The standoff barrier must be high enough that you can't lean over really, even for an adult. There should be warning signs. You don't see that in this picture, but there should be warning signs on the standoff barrier. And it should be wide enough that you can touch the enclosure fence even when you're leaning over. It should be difficult to climb as well. So a couple of examples of very current examples actually from zoos here in Ontario, roadside zoos, menageries, whatever you want to call them. This is a picture I took, and you can see there is no standoff barrier for this enclosure that holds an African porcupine. And you might think like, it's a porcupine, what can go wrong? The quills of a porcupine can very easily stab you through a finger, through any part of your body. They're extremely, extremely sharp, and they're also barbed and scaled. So that means to remove them is very, very difficult. And I can speak from my own experience that a friend of mine who lived in Spain, who they have porcupines there, and he found a quill on the road, and he took it, and I was playing with it, and I cut my finger in no time because they're extremely sharp. So the idea that people can come close to these animals, possibly spook them, and cause some sort of issue, some sort of attack, some sort of defense reaction, that should be considered at all times. So standoff barriers really should just be part of the enclosure design. This is a lemur enclosure in another zoo in Ontario. Same idea, ring-tailed lemurs. The primates, they're wild, they're very unpredictable, and it can become very aggressive. They live in a hierarchy, so if you don't know their language and what they meant or tend to do or how they react, they can lash out easily and they could grab you through the fencing. So my point here is that it's not only lions and tigers that need consideration of building these enclosures, also smaller, maybe appear less dangerous animals, or they appear to be less dangerous, similar standards apply. So for enclosure fencing, and I think this is an important one, no matter if an animal is bred in captivity, and no matter if it's claimed to be tame, standard enclosure size for lions and tigers must be 16 feet without a roof. If it's roof, it can be 12 feet, and that's just to give the animal space so they can climb. But without a roof, it must be 16 feet, and this is accepted throughout the professional zoo community. There is no argument over it. The fence limit was raised in 2008 when a tiger in San Francisco Zoo managed to jump or climb a 12.5 feet fence. And at that time, people thought they couldn't do that. So then the international standard was raised to 16. And even that is including some other measures to prevent them from escaping. Because, for example, there's also been reports that like a Bengal tiger was able to climb over a 15 feet structure. And in the EU and Australia, there were tigers that were actually taught to climb a tree trunk that was 20 to 30 feet. So just the height of the fencing is not enough, and I'll go into that a bit later. Again, a couple of pictures how the situation here is in Ontario. So this is an enclosure that held Timberwolf Pups. So wolves are wild animals. And as you can see, there was no standoff barrier. And honestly, these animals could have jumped out in a second. I visited in April, so these animals were at least 4 months old, which means they almost reached full mature size. Extremely, extremely dangerous. I can't emphasize that enough. And Rob and I have a bit of a running joke that if we visit these places, we should have our running shoes on just in case. This is another example of a zoo, and you can see the lady in front and how close she is to the top of the fencing. And this is it's a tiger enclosure. I don't see if you can see the tiger below the structure, but this was an old tiger enclosure. So we've seen it all when it comes to how these animals are being held. And this picture was taken last year, I believe, 2 years ago. And again, you can see how the structure itself lifts up the animal and brings it closer to the top of the actual fence height, which just makes it easier for the animal to cover the distance when they attempt to escape. I do want to say, I'm not trying to scare people, but I think it's very important that we need to take precautions and not wait until something materializes, something bad happens in order to say, oh, we have to change standards or did we do, if we only did something. People that hold these animals must be held accountable, or who keep these animals must be held accountable to at least provide a safe environment for the people in the neighborhood or people that are visiting that the animals cannot escape. So about enclosure fencing, and this becomes a bit technical, so I won't spend too much time on it. What we've seen a lot are deer fencing, which is the top picture. It's quite regular fencing you can find anywhere, but that's an absolutely no-go. These fences are not as strong and can definitely not hold a tiger or lion within its enclosure. Instead, what is used is chain link fence, which you can see below. which is interlinked, which makes it stronger. Recommended gauge is 9 thickness. And with the enclosure in general, ideally it's made of galvanized materials, not wood, for example, because it's really easy for it to wear and tear or to get damaged or even rotting. Also important is that there's an overhang, and I can show you that here. So this is the outline of how a lion or a tiger enclosure should look like. As you can see, there are vertical and horizontal support posts that are equally distributed. The vertical support posts are also anchored within concrete. And at the top, you can see there's a 4 feet overhang that is angled inwards. So even when a tiger or a lion or another animal tries to climb upwards, they won't be able to do that because they can't make that leap over once they're upside down. Also, what is important here is that the 2 feet concrete barrier sidewalk, some animals are very handy when it comes to digging. So it's important that there is enough space that protects there's enough area that would prevent the animal from digging underneath the fencing. And I know it's all quite technical, and I'm happy to share this presentation. You can reach out to Rob or leave your contact information, and I'm happy to share this. Some more pictures that were taken in recent years to the zoos that I've been to, and this is all in Ontario. So as you can see, these enclosures are mostly built out of wood, and wear and tear is very, very visible. It's hard to maintain. It might be cheaper to build an enclosure from wood at the onset, but when it comes to wear and tear and replacing it, and the chance that an animal can escape because it's not as stable, it is very real, that risk. This is a tiger enclosure. As you can see, there is no overhang whatsoever. The enclosure is also quite low for a tiger. And also it doesn't seem to have a concrete skirt, so it doesn't look like the support posts are anchored within concrete. And a final picture of a lion enclosure. As you can see, clearly they're using deer fencing here, and you can see the fence actually being very warped, which means that it could even carry less weight really than if it would be without the warp. Also, there is an overhang, but it's fairly damaged. You can't really see that in this picture. Overall, it's a substandard enclosure and frankly dangerous. If a lion is motivated enough, I don't think these barriers would stop them. So then the next point when it comes to safety is physical contact between staff and dangerous animals and visitors. It's simply a no-go, as I mentioned before. So other things to think about when looking at enclosures, or what should be considered when building an enclosure that holds dangerous animals, is that you can use a secondary barrier, like an electrical wire, as a complement to the main barrier. The electrical wire can never serve as the primary barrier. So if there is an enclosure without an overhang, but they have an electrical wire on top and they say that's fine, it isn't. The overhang would supersede the electrical wire. Making sure that doors and gates fit properly, that there aren't big gaps between the doors, between the framework, making sure that there are padlocks that cannot be opened by just anybody. And there should be warnings out throughout the property as well as on the property line to ensure that people know that there are dangerous animals being held on that property. Some things people might not always think of when we look at designing or how to help these dangerous animals are emergency plans and protocols, which are highly critical. And it doesn't mean that they are implemented every year, but you need them, you will need them eventually if an animal escapes, which we've seen plenty through utility failure. So for example, when there is a big storm, a good example is in 2018 in Germany, where a private zoo had lions and a bear and tigers and a jaguar escape after flooding. So the zoo was located near a riverbank or a flood area, and there were heavy thunderstorms in the night and flash floods, which damaged the enclosures and which ended up all these animals escaping. And I think the bear even, they shot it for out of safety reasons. Human injury and distress. So what happens, if an animal escapes or something happens and a member of the public or a staff member gets injured, like there are a mandatory reporting to public health, but there should be strict protocols in place how to deal with those situations. As well, what would you do with the public if a member of the public is in an animal enclosure, which we have seen in recent years, especially in lion enclosures. Somehow people find it interesting to climb into them. I think the recent one was in New York or in the States somewhere. But all these events, you have to plan for them. They might never happen, but that doesn't mean you don't have to plan for them. Also, pest control programs. These animals eat a lot. They defecate a lot. There's a lot of garbage and such that people visit. So you have to make sure that the hygiene is up to date and that things are clean. An exit strategy. So let's say somebody passes away who runs a zoo or they become bankrupt. What would happen with the animals? There should be a plan for that. As well, first responders in the area should be informed about dangerous animals being kept at that property and making sure that you share all these plans with police and firefighters, and if there's a hospital in the neighborhood, within the hospital as well. This is actually very common for people or researchers that hold, for example, dangerous snakes or poisonous snakes. They make sure that hospitals and others are aware that these animals are on the property in case something happens and people have to go in to rescue or to save the property. In conclusion, all captive animal facilities, whether they keep wild animals that were caught from the wild or wild animals who were captive bred, should operate according to the latest professional zoo or sanctuary standards. And there are plenty, and they're publicly available. So there's really no reason for anybody to ignore these standards, whether it's a professional run zoo or somebody who chooses to keep an animal that is potentially dangerous. And that's it for me. I thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to answer any questions if there are any.
Okay, great. We do have some questions, and the way we've set it up is we're receiving your questions, and then we'll tell everybody what the question is and provide an answer. So we'll start, well, I'll just pick them randomly because there's a bunch. This question is how, and Michelle, you can hear this, how has been the best way to influence municipalities to proactively create bylaws, and what happens once an individual moves into a municipality without a bylaw? What is the best way to influence development of a bylaw? So you want to take a stab at that, Michelle? I
can start. You can help me out. So the first part of the question is how to make sure that bylaws or municipalities take precautionary measures and put in bylaws into place. That's a good question, and I don't think there's a golden or one solution. I think it depends. Some local politicians are highly motivated, and you talk to them once and they can see the danger and understand that something needs to be done. Sometimes, unfortunately, it takes an accident to happen, as we saw in New Brunswick, for example, when two kids were asphyxiated by a rock python, and all of a sudden everybody was looking into the regulations in order to change something. I think in general, if your municipality doesn't have a bylaw, approach them, build a relationship with your local council, and share information. You can also always put them in touch with organizations like Rob's and World Animal Protection for more information. And that will be my first step, I think, for a campaign like that.
Yeah, and I would add, I think the building relationships with local elected officials is critically important. A lot of them, when you talk to them, they're not very familiar with animal issues. And when you put yourself into their position, they're sitting there as a mayor or a member of council, or it could even apply to bureaucrats within the municipal structure as well. But, they are there, and they are receiving information from a whole variety of sources. So they may be receiving information from the people who want to keep animals. There may be people outside the community that support them and they bring information. There may be people that are in the community that just like the idea, and they will engage council. So the councilors or the mayor or bureaucrats may be getting all kinds of different kinds of information from a variety of sources. And it's not always just for and against. Sometimes there's all the usual nuances in between in people's positions. But definitely, like Michelle said, it's engaging with elected officials, making sure that they understand the issues, that they have the pertinent information so that they can make either individually in their own minds or as a collective with a council or whatever, that they can make informed deliberations on an issue. I think one of the biggest problems has been a lot of people don't understand the issues. This is something we used to see with circus animals, and now circuses with wild animals are largely gone, and they have very little support. Even the big circus promoters don't like it and have moved away from them for a whole variety of reasons, including animal welfare. But in the old days, when animal welfare groups were trying to deal with circus animal cruelty issues, it was very difficult to get across to people all of the information that was necessary for them to make an informed decision. And it was made all the more difficult because there were all kinds of people on the other side that were giving them information that was contrary. So it's sometimes very challenging, but it is important that councilors and mayors and bureaucrats receive information, that they are made aware as best you can be or as best you can do of the issues. And what we found, and Michelle alluded to it, is that many years ago it was a real challenge, but today 9 times out of 10 it's the municipalities themselves that are proactively pursuing these things, that are saying, hey, we've got a problem already, or we don't want a problem in our municipality, let's do something. So it's really been a sea change in the last few decades, from the point that we started, where it was a fringe issue that nobody wanted to deal with, and it was very challenging, to now today, almost every council that we go to, or every other type of body, takes these issues very seriously. But again, getting the information, establishing a relationship with elected officials, and not just having the one meeting, but establishing a real relationship and making sure that they are aware of everything that they should be made aware of without being too annoying.
Yeah, and part 2 of that question, if people bring in these animals and there's no bylaw in place, I think the first step that needs to be taken is encouraging local officials to put in a bylaw that would regulate the keeping of these animals. So at least they have some control over the situation. Often that would be the first step to keep it short.
Okay, let's jump to another question here, and feel like a game show host. My kids want to go to a local zoo where they allow people to pet the adult tigers. Is this safe? Well, we sort of answered that in the question, but why don't you respond to that, Michelle?
No, it's not safe. That's a
okay.
It's not safe, and I know it's it might be portrayed as such, I think, but it's a sign. If you are allowed within a zoo to touch a wild animal, it's a sign that that zoo does not meet accepted global standard for professional zoological institutions. It's absolutely not safe. I cannot emphasize that enough.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is a lot of people may look at, okay, I want to pet the tiger's tail or the back of the tiger, through the fence. What's the big deal with that? It's behind the fence. But like we mentioned earlier, there have been numerous maulings and deaths of people that have been killed through barriers, including here in Canada. But also there's other things that can happen, because one of the dangers of anybody putting their fingers into a cage with a large predator of any kind is that their fingers will be bitten off. And we've been contacted over the years by numerous law firms where bears and cats and other animals have bitten their fingers off. And here in Ontario, there's been cases where that's happened with primates and other creatures. But another danger that all zookeepers recognize and take into consideration is there's also an ability for cats and bears and other animals to crush fingers and to break bones just through pressing with their body. And that's something that you see this talked about in the zoo standards and zoo husbandry literature. So there's a number of issues with touching animals, even when you think it seems safe. It probably isn't, and it's bad for the animal.
Yeah, and they can react in a split second. I can tell you from personal experience working with chimpanzees, for example. Experienced keepers, they might get a bit complacent and they come a little bit too close to the fence, and before they know it, their clothes are ripped or whatever. It's really, these animals are wild animals, and they will always retain that kind of nature. And sometimes they'll do it with chimpanzees, they'll do it on purpose. A lot of these animals are really smart, they know what's happening. So it's better just not even go down that route and try to touch them.
Well, and I'll mention one other real life example. A number of years ago, we were contacted by an attorney here in Canada that was working with a US law firm, and a very experienced bear keeper had gotten into the practice in a service way, a keeper service way, of throwing raisins through a small little window to the bear. And she had been doing this for a long time, and the bear loved the raisins. Well, one time she couldn't quite see the bear, and when she put her hand up to throw the raisin, the bear leaped out, pushed its muzzle through the window and grabbed her finger and wouldn't let go, and then kept pulling more and more, and she lost her arm as a result. So things can happen even when you're experienced, and when you're dealing with people that don't understand the risks, that aren't usually around animals, those risks can be enhanced by orders of magnitude.
Also, I know the question mentioned adult tigers. It's also a no-go for tiger cubs or juvenile tigers for many reasons. They might be not necessarily able to kill you. They can definitely give scratches and injure a person. It's just poor practice overall to interact with wild animals.
Okay, another question. I recently visited a facility with a tiger that looked cross-eyed. Could it be a sign that it was inbred? Want to take that one?
I cannot answer that. I would not know. There are reasons why animals might look different than your normal tiger or lion. I mean, there is something with inbreeding that there are characteristics, or they're more prone to having certain abnormalities. But on that information alone, I couldn't say.
Yeah, it's hard to say in that individual circumstance. We do know that most of the tigers that are outside of an official zoo stud book program, that's basically a breeding registry of zoos that have a particular species. So it could be Siberian tigers or Bengal tigers. If they're not in that stud book program, which mostly it's accredited zoos that are parts of those programs, and then other types of institutional settings. But if they're not in that, or they're not in what's called a species survival plan, or its equivalent in another part of the world, then if they're not in those programs, then the tiger's probably at the least a hybrid, and quite possibly very inbred. And you see that in a lot of tigers in Ontario, where they've got sway backs and distorted faces, and they look very, very different. But if you're looking for animals that have the equivalent of being a pureblood in the species, then you'd be looking at organized programs, because that's what they're looking for. They want to maintain the genetic integrity of the original animal, and they don't allow hybridization, and they do everything that they can to avoid inbreeding. Okay, let's have a look here. I know someone who was bitten by a monkey and lost a finger. Can you comment on what professional standards are regarding primates, I guess, for safety? Well, you worked with primates, Michelle, so.
Yeah, well, first of all, common practice is that you don't interact with them, even if you're a keeper. So it's a hands-off protocol for keepers as well for visitors. So as mentioned in my presentation, a standoff barrier usually mitigates the risk of people getting to the fence. Often with primates, as you see, they have double or triple fences. Like they'll have an electrical wire and a fence, and maybe another electrical wire, and then a bit of nothingness, and then you have the standoff barrier. Monkeys are incredibly smart. They're agile. They can, they climb. They're very fast. So a lot of precautions need to be taken in order to keep them safe and to keep the public safe. But what I usually see with the keeping of these animals is at least one or two barriers that will be the enclosure, and then you have a bit of nothingness, and then you have the standoff barrier where people will stay behind in order to not come closer.
Okay, we've got another one. This is a good one. I think it was based on something I said. Can you explain why touching an animal through a barrier is bad for the animal? Well, there's one obvious way that allowing people to get close enough to touch animals is bad, and it happens in zoos throughout the world. And that is, people will jab them. Sometimes they'll take implements. They may have an umbrella and jab an animal in the side or in the face. That does happen. So there's certainly the potential for some level of injury. And if you have animals that are a bit more fragile, they're not as robust as a wolf or a tiger, then they can be in some jeopardy. But another reason why you don't want petting is that when you look at animals in captivity, particularly in very spatially restricted environments, in environments that are behaviorally impoverished, in that they're not, structurally enhanced and filled with furnishings and objects, and there's not temporal enrichment and food there's not all these things going on, then those animals tend to focus on barriers, and big cats particularly, and bears, and all the other wide-ranging carnivores, and there's a whole range of other species. That lack of a good environment manifests itself by pacing. It's called the stereotypic behavior, and there's a whole pile of different stereotypic behaviors. But for big cats and bears, that pacing would occur along the perimeters, so along fence lines or walls or other barriers. And what you want to do is you want to get the animal into the living space that it's got. You want it to be flexible and complex, give them things to do, allow them to make choices so that they use that space and they're not centered on the barrier, because it's a challenge to get them away from the barriers right from the get-go. So you don't want something that, let's say you have an animal that likes to be scratched. Well, you're reinforcing that animal's behavior of coming to the barrier. You're actually causing that animal to focus more on the barrier when the whole intent should be to get it away from that barrier, because you don't want it pacing stereotypically back and forth along there. So there's a number of different ways it can be bad for animals. One other way that comes to mind is that animals will also, when they're focused on barriers, figure out ways to get out. You see this with orangutans. They're beautiful escape artists. They will focus on barriers often for different reasons, but they will focus on barriers and look and study, and they'll figure ways to get out. So there's a lot of reasons why you don't want animals focused on barriers. But for me, I think the most important is we want them, if they're going to be in captivity, to be doing things, to be engaging in their life, not just standing around at barriers. And I've seen all too many animals over the years just focused on barriers, and that's what their lives are, and there's nothing else much in them. Next question. Michelle, you can try this. When animals pace along a fence line, is that natural or a stressed animal? So I sort of started it for you. So
it's an unnatural behavior that's caused by impoverished environment, as Rob mentioned. So you wouldn't see it in the wild. That's pretty much the standard. If you look at behaviors in the wild, if they display anything else in captivity, it's often repetitive. It's often without a certain goal in mind. Those are abnormal behaviors, and they're usually caused because of an unacceptable environment, inadequate environment. That's what I wanted to say. There is, yeah, I'll leave it at that. But it's an abnormal behavior. It can be stress. It can be other things. Sometimes they pace because it's feeding time, and they know that, and they get very like kind of nervous, and they displace that energy or replace that energy what they have. Like usually they would go search for food. They replace that and into that pacing behavior. So it's kind of a behavior that replaces natural behaviors because they can't do anything else. They can't engage in anything else.
Yeah, and I should just add that a lot of people focus on the stereotypic behaviors, but there are actually a whole range of abnormal behaviors that you rarely, if ever, encounter in the wild that are manifested in captive animals. And that includes so-called lower animals like reptiles, amphibians, fish, and invertebrates. But just to give you an idea, some of them, there are animals that, like the gorillas at the Toronto Zoo, that will vomit, eat up the vomit, vomit, eat up the vomit. There are animals that will be hypersexual. There are animals that will be hyper-aggressive. Probably one of the most abnormal behaviors out of all of them is animals doing nothing, because they don't get up in the morning and just sit around and do nothing, whereas animals in captivity often are inactive, and it's a forced inactivity because they would probably want to do things, but they can't. And there's been all kinds of studies that show, depending on the species, animals may be put into a state of forced idleness from anywhere from 25 to almost 100% of their time. So there's a whole range of abnormal behaviors, but pacing is just one of them, and it's probably one that most people see at one point or another if they look at animals in captivity.
That or the not moving at all, not being active. I think that's often there's a misconception that that's natural. I mean, yes, lions and tigers are active at night, so during the day they lie around. But if that's repetitive behavior that's shown over a certain amount of time, that can be classified as abnormal.
Okay, next question. I've been told by someone that owns tigers that they like small enclosures. Is that true?
That is not true. Size doesn't always matter when it comes to the environment. When there is a lot of complexity, a lot of enrichment, which doesn't mean just throw a ball in the enclosure and you're done. Enrichment needs a lot of thought. It needs to evolve over time. It needs to be measured to be effective. But in general, the more space, the better. A captive environment can never replace the natural environment, no matter how big or small a territory is. And especially with long-ranging animals that are either migratory or they put a lot of effort into hunting. So they are searching for food, like, 10 hours, 15 hours out of the day. For those animal, captivity is really, really harsh because, and it's acknowledged now, right? Like elephants, we see less elephants in sanctuary or in zoos, or polar bears, because we know these animals really suffer in captivity because they're meant to walk and to move and to search. And that cannot be provided, no matter how big the enclosure would be really in a zoo setting.
Yeah, and when you look at tigers, when you look at the low end of their home range in the wild, you're looking at tens or hundreds of square kilometers. And if you're looking at Amur tigers, or some of them that live more in northern environments, you're looking at probably thousands of square kilometers of home range. And when you look at that, whether it's tropical rainforest or mountain and forest in Siberia, you're looking at these incredibly complex environments that give animals mental stimulation, physical stimulation, the sights, sounds, textures, everything changes. It's a very enriched kind of environment. This is what you want to try to replicate in captivity. And there's sort of a rule when it comes to space when you're looking at animals. And you know, there are mitigating circumstances, but in general, the rule is bigger is better, because there's no downside to providing an animal more space than it needs, but there's a huge downside to the animal in not providing it with enough space. So you want to go as big as you can, especially for wide-ranging animals. And there's three questions that you can ask about space when you look at it. It's number one, how much space does the animal need to express normal movements and behaviors? And certainly for tigers, they would need acres and acres, I would think. How much space do animals need to feel safe and secure? So are people getting close, or are other animals nearby that are going to stress it? And then what are the consequences of not providing enough space? And you see that manifested in things like pacing and all of that. But no, I would agree with, actually, Michelle, we could have given a very short answer of no. But it's a crazy notion. I think it's disingenuous of people to suggest that wide-ranging animals that have evolved to live in these types of big environments like small spaces. That seems kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, because I think where it comes from is that these animals are very lethargic, so they don't move a lot, and therefore people think it's fine, they don't need the space, or they always are in a certain area of the enclosure, so therefore they think they're not using the rest of the enclosure, so they don't need it. But that's the world upside down, right? Like, captivity is abnormal as it is, so the animals need to be motivated to move around and engage in natural behaviors which will make them feel good. So regardless if an animal is always in the same area, that means something is wrong with the husbandry and not that the animal doesn't need the space.
Okay, we'll do a couple more, and because we're almost out of time.
Yeah.
Let's see. If a tiger were to get loose, how far could the animal travel in a day? Well, I guess I'll take a stab at that. If you look at tigers in the wild, again, you know, a lot about what happens in captivity and how you manage that, whether it's the actual biological needs of the animals, psychological needs of the animals, particular ways of delivering on your husbandry and management regime and all of that. That should be informed by the natural life of the animal in the wild. And that's one of the concepts that's been articulated through the science of zoobiology, which emerged just after World War II, that you look at the animal in the wild to see really what should you do with that animal in captivity. And certainly, I've lost my, I've lost the question.
They can go far.
Yes, yes, sorry.
At night, yeah, they easily can cover 38 kilometers in one single night. But
yeah,
go on.
And that's not to say that they would, but they do have the physical capacity to move quite a distance. But even if they don't, it can still be really problematic. There's been cases in Ontario where, for instance, near Barrie, there was a menagerie that had a tiger jump out of one of its cages, and they couldn't find that tiger for days. There was a brown bear that was on the loose down in the Niagara region for a week, and they had first responders, they had helicopters, police, animal control people, everybody looking for this bear. They couldn't find it. There were monkeys that have been on the loose for years. You know, when they get out, even if they don't move far, they can be very hard to find, very hard to catch. And certainly for some of the animals, if they chose to do so or were forced to do so, they could travel considerable distances. We'll do one more, and then call it a night.
Also, lots of questions in the chat. I don't know.
Oh, okay. Are cats that are bred in captivity at a greater risk to be compromised mentally and physically?
Yes. The answer is yes. Because they aren't usually able to engage in natural behaviors, many of the animals, especially in roadside zoos and menageries, are taken from their mom at a very, very young age to be bottle fed in order for them to be tame enough to handle in person by whoever owns them. So they have not experienced any natural natural education, I would say. They haven't experienced how it is to hunt or to, all those natural behaviors are kind of suppressed really because they have to fit in this framework of being tame enough to be handled and petted and such. When animals are not able to engage in natural behaviors, there are certain behaviors that are very intrinsic to animals. If they cannot engage in it, it will cause stress, and if that stress cannot be resolved, it will cause long-term damage, psychological damage. And a lot of animals you see in captivity, they're either very skinny or very fat. In Ontario, you see if you go to a zoo in the spring, especially the roadside zoos, they tend to be very skinny because they have to survive the winter. But towards the end of the season, they are plump because they don't move and they get overweight.
Okay, on that note about obesity and zoo animals, we're out of time, so we're going to close it off. Thank you everybody for listening. Hopefully there were one or two points or more that you hadn't known about or hadn't considered, and hopefully this little session creates some more discussion about this whole issue wherever it may be. So thank you very much, everybody.
And feel free to reach out with more questions or if you need more information.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you and good night.
Thank you.